On election night last Tuesday, Deborah Dorbert was at a watch party in Florida, eagerly awaiting the results on one measure about abortion.
They said it was going to be close, but we all felt confident that it was going to pass.
The watch party was thrown by an advocacy group called Yes on 4. Deborah had been working with them to pass Amendment 4 in Florida. This would have enshrined a right to abortion in the state constitution, overturning the state's 6-week abortion ban.
I was preparing to speak if Amendment 4 had passed. So we were there when the news broke out that it did not pass.
The ballot measure needed 60% of the vote to pass. It just fell short, getting 57%. Florida's 6-week abortion ban would remain in place, and it's one of the most restrictive bans in the country.
I mean, me and my husband both broke down that night after getting that news. We cried, and it hurt, like to see the law still in effect.
This loss and this issue is deeply personal for Deborah and her husband. Deborah was pregnant with her second child 2 years ago when she got terrible news after an ultrasound.
Back in November of 2022, our son got diagnosed with Potter syndrome, which is a life-threatening condition that's not compatible with life, and that he would pass away shortly after birth.
But given Florida's abortion law at the time, doctors would not honor Deborah's request to end her pregnancy. She was forced to carry her baby to term. In March 2023, Deborah gave birth to her son Milo. He had no kidneys and underdeveloped lungs. He lived for 99 minutes.
It is a hard journey to be on, having to have witnessed new life and death all in the same day. And so that's why we got more involved with it, because we want to bring change so no one else has to go through what we went through.
As Deborah was working through her grief over the failure of Amendment 4 last week, elsewhere in Florida, people were celebrating the outcome.
Everybody, just so you know, Amendment 4, the abortion, has failed.
In West Palm Beach, Donald Trump supporters gathered for their own election night watch party. They were also watching the Amendment 4 results closely. Hannah Patry was among the couple of hundred people there.
I think it's great because I stand for the child's ability to survive. I mean, a woman is carrying the child, but it's really not her life. And so I want, and I also think...
Florida wasn't the only place last week where voters got to directly weigh in on abortion.
So 7 states passed abortion rights measures, and they failed in 3 other states, including Florida.
Molly Hennessy-Fisk is a reporter covering abortion and the election for The Post. She says there's good reason why both sides say they had victories last week. Ballot measures protecting or expanding abortion rights passed in New York, Maryland, Montana, Nevada, Arizona, Colorado, and Missouri. But they failed in Nebraska, South Dakota, and crucially, Florida. And there are questions about what a second Trump term could mean for abortion access nationwide.
And so both sides were claiming victory, but it really is a very mixed picture, especially with Trump coming into office, given the fact that his administration could restrict abortion rights further.
From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Elahe Izadi. It's Tuesday, November 12th. Today, we unpack the election results on abortion. Molly explains what the results tell us about how Americans feel about abortion, and the ways abortion access could change during a second Trump presidency. Molly, I do want to narrow in on the results. in a few states in particular. But before we get to specific states, I want to break down even further this bigger picture. You had said, 7 states passed abortion protections in this election. 3 states did not. And so I want to know what abortion access looks like right now in terms of numbers. How many people will have access to abortion services post-election compared to before the election?
So after the election, we have about 2 million people who are no longer living in a state with an abortion ban, largely because the Arizona and Missouri measures passed. Before the election, nationwide, about 57% of women of what we call reproductive age, so ages 15 to 44, were living in a state where abortion was legal. And after the election, that will rise to about 61% of women because those abortion bans were overturned. But there's a big caveat with that, which is, and this is why Florida drew so much attention and there was so much campaigning to try to get Amendment 4, the Florida measure, passed. There was a lot at stake there because Florida has a ban, but access in Florida, if the ban had been overturned, would have created a lot of access for the whole region. And the South is what's referred to as an abortion desert because so many nearby states in the South have abortion bans. So because Florida didn't overturn its ban, that means 4 million women don't have access. So there were gains, but then there were losses at the same time.
If we were to look at the landscape of where ballot measures, amendments, all that sort of thing, where voters got an opportunity to vote directly on how they feel about abortion access. Is there a clear takeaway? Like, can we clearly say one way or the other how the vast majority of Americans feel about abortion access right now?
Well, there's polls, and we can generalize and say, well, most Americans support abortion access, but they also support some limits on it. But that's not very specific, right? So you can say in Florida, the measure didn't pass, the abortion rights measure didn't pass, but at the same time, it got 57% approval. Florida requires a 60% approval threshold, which is the highest in the country. So
for an amendment to pass, you mean?
That's right. So you could say if this had been on the ballot in another state, it would have passed with a simple majority, which is what happened in some of these other states like Arizona. But because the threshold is so high in Florida, it didn't pass. And so that's what supporters of the measure said is we came so close, and it shows that more than half of the people who have voted want abortion access.
I'm also wondering about Kamala Harris's loss. Does her loss say anything about how people feel, how Americans feel about abortion access, given that there are states where Donald Trump won, red states, deeply red states, but so did abortion access amendments? Is there any takeaway from Harris's loss since she made reproductive rights such a big part of her campaign?
Yeah, I think it's important to note that in Missouri, in Arizona, in Nevada, in Montana, not only did Trump prevail and abortion rights ballot measures passed, but in some of these states, we had Republican senators who won. And in some of those Senate races, the Democrats, like in Florida, for instance, the Democrats tried to tie themselves to abortion rights, to abortion access. So I think the effort to connect these Democrat campaigns to abortion rights probably wasn't successful. At the same time, a lot of these ballot campaigns, like in Florida and Arizona and other states, distanced themselves or tried to distance themselves from Democrats and emphasize that abortion rights is a nonpartisan issue. Abortion rights support goes across party affiliation, across a lot of different demographic differences. And when I was talking to those folks after the election, they said they feel like that was a really successful approach and that it paid off in terms of the results.
That's so fascinating. Let's talk about a state like that. Missouri, deeply conservative, very red, voted for Trump by pretty wide margins, but also passed abortion rights protections, as you said. Help me understand the dynamic specifically in Missouri.
Well, Missouri was a really big deal for abortion rights advocates because it was the first time that we saw a near total ban on abortion overturned by a ballot measure. It was also one of the first states to pass an abortion ban We saw in the lead up to this ballot measure even getting on the ballot, there was a lot of state opposition. There was a lot of legal efforts to try to block the ballot measure from getting on the ballot, to adjust the wording. There was a court battle, but they succeeded in not only getting it on the ballot, but then building somewhat bipartisan support among voters for it to get it to pass.
Were there people who voted for Trump and abortion protections?
Yes, there were in Missouri and other states, too. And I talked to some of them. Actually, I talked to some of them in Florida ahead of the election who were explaining why that some of them were transplants who moved from other states and had supported Trump, but also called themselves pro-choice. Some of them were people who were religious and liked a lot of the other things that Trump stood for, but they saw abortion as not a religious issue, as a rights issue. And some of them were women, but also men, the ones I talked to in Florida.
Let's actually talk about Florida now. I know that you spent some time there during the campaign. And when we're talking about what was on the ballot there in Florida, it was called Amendment 4, and that would have enshrined abortion protections in the state constitution. What's the impact of the loss of Amendment 4, not just for Florida, but for the South as a whole?
Yeah, it was a really large, strategic loss because so many of the states in the Deep South, just north of Florida, have abortion bans. And so Florida was a place where women could travel to get reproductive health care. And so that's what was at stake. And I even had talked to abortion care providers after the Florida ban took effect, where they were seeing patients coming all the way up into the Midwest from Florida because they couldn't get care anywhere else. The closest place actually was North Carolina, but then some of those clinics would have waiting lists. And so people were having to travel even further, and they're still going to have to travel that far now.
Mm-hmm. And then, given what you've said, that it required a 60% threshold to win in Florida. It fell short, but 57% of people did vote for it. So it does make me wonder about the future of abortion rights there. Since a majority of people did vote for it, do those who want to have further access to abortion in Florida feel like, actually, there's some opportunity here to try again? Can they do that?
So I had talked to people before the election about, what if this fails? Will you try again? And at first, people said to me, now, this was a really massive campaign. They had gotten a lot of funding. They had a lot of momentum. They just couldn't see themselves doing this again. But that's not what I'm hearing since the election, especially given the 57%. I think people are encouraged, especially nationally, seeing it as an opportunity. And so they may do it again. I mean, they do have the possibility, at least, of doing ballot measures in Florida. In a number of other states, like Texas, where I am, you can't do a citizen-led ballot measure. But in Florida, at least, it is an option, and they see that possibility of building more support.
I'm curious to learn a little more about the possible impacts these results could have on people's lives in places like Florida. Earlier, we had heard from a woman, Deborah Dorbert, who originally spoke to her colleague, reporter Frances Stead Sellers, in 2023. And as we heard, Deborah was forced to carry a pregnancy to term despite her baby having a fatal congenital condition and after doctors refused to perform an abortion. This is what Deborah told us last week, reflecting on the measure in Florida failing to pass.
It has definitely changed my view of the United States and life itself, of just how much hate there is out there and how people judge one another and don't respect other people's opinions or perspectives or morals or values. And then I have, some siblings, even after everything I went through, they still don't see anything wrong with what happened to me and that I was forced to carry to term. They are still against abortion, and they don't see anything wrong with what I went through and how it has affected my life. It is still impacting my life today. And it'll probably take a long time for me to recover from this.
Does that story carry echoes of what else you're hearing around the country?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of families that are very divided about this, neighbors, friends. But I think there's also a lot of conversations that are going on about it. When I was in Florida, I talked to a young woman in her 20s who said she was talking to her mother about it and trying to get her mother to understand a pregnancy scare that she had had and what the state's abortion ban meant for her and for people her age, and that it really informed her mother's decision about how she was going to vote. So I think there are some people who are not going to change their minds hearing stories about women dying because they don't have access to abortion care, to miscarriage management care late in their pregnancies doesn't change some people's minds. And some people don't believe in rape or incest exceptions for religious reasons or other reasons. But I do think that as we hear more of these stories about the extreme impacts of almost absolute bans, that people's voting patterns may be impacted by that.
After the break, how Trump's second term could change abortion access across the country, including whether a federal abortion ban is on the table. We'll be right back. Molly, I know we're talking about the results of the election on a state level when it comes to abortion access and abortion bans, but there is a new president who will install a new federal administration. And now I want to understand the ramifications of Trump's win for abortion access. So first, how has Donald Trump talked about abortion during his campaign?
So it's really interesting. At first, it looked like Trump might vote for the abortion rights amendment in Florida because, of course, he's a Florida resident.
Wait, why did it seem like he would vote for it?
Well, he has said that he thinks 6 weeks is not enough time for a woman to decide whether or not she wants to have an abortion. And right now, the law in Florida bans abortion around the 6-week mark.
Well, I think the 6 week is too short. It has to be more time, and I've told them that I want more weeks.
So you'll vote in favor of the amendment?
I am going to be voting that we need more than 6 weeks. Look,
so Trump has issues with the state ban, but then in the end, he didn't say how he voted, so he's muddied the waters on that.
Has Trump said anything about what he would do if Congress passes a federal ban on abortion if it landed on his desk?
During the presidential debate, Trump said he was not signing a national abortion ban because he didn't think it would be needed.
I'm not signing a ban, and there's no reason to sign a ban because we've gotten what everybody wanted. Democrats.
But at the same time, I think it's important to note that he doesn't have to enact a national abortion ban. He can do other things that would amount to a national abortion ban. His administration can do those things administratively.
Tell me more about that, Molly. What could Trump do without even legislation coming across his desk and him signing it into law administratively to impact abortion access federally?
Well, there's a couple things that the Trump administration could do to effectively limit abortion right administratively, sort of quietly. They could impose limits on abortion pills through the Food and Drug Administration. And that's pretty significant because most abortions in America before Roe and after are done with medication abortion pills at the beginning of pregnancies. So that would have a really big impact. And it would have an impact not only in conservative states with abortion bans where people may be getting these pills by mail, but it would also have an impact in blue states as well, in liberal states that don't have bans. The administration could also enforce the Comstock Act, which is a law from 1873 that makes it a federal crime to send or receive materials that are considered obscene or that might be used for abortion-causing purposes. So that would limit not just abortion pills, but also any kind of devices or things used in abortion clinics. And again, that would have an impact in states that don't have any kind of abortion bans.
So the Comstock Act, people bring this up all the time. I mean, how likely is it that his administration would enforce it.
Yeah, I think when we're looking at what the Trump administration could do on abortion policy, it's helpful to look at Project 2025, which is a conservative blueprint, suggestions for what another Trump administration could do. Now, Trump has tried to distance himself from Project 2025, but I think given the folks who are involved with it, a lot of conservative leaders, folks who've been pretty strongly allied with Trump, it's useful to look at that as what could potentially happen. And Project 2025 doesn't name the Comstock Act, but it refers to it. And it also goes through potential FDA restrictions on abortion medication. So I think that's something to be taken seriously.
Molly, how are activists and organizers on both sides of this issue thinking about their next steps now?
Well, I think anti-abortion groups are definitely encouraged by seeing the Florida ballot measure go down and hoping that the Trump administration will be friendly to more of these measures to reduce abortion access, not only in states that already have some sorts of bans, but also in other states. And so they're looking at where they could gain some ground. But then abortion rights groups are trying to strategize about how to protect the places where they've already shored up abortion rights.
We're in a new territory. The way that we think campaigning works really needs to be examined. We need to throw all of our assumptions out the window.
So before the election, I went down to South Florida and went out with folks who were canvassing to raise awareness about the amendment and other issues. And one of the groups I went with was Mi Vecino, which is an organizing group. And they had been canvassing voters, in particular Latino voters, in different parts of the state. And one of the organizers I talked to was Alex Berrios. And this is what he had to say after the measure failed to pass.
I'm old enough to remember Democratic leaders saying Republicans are never going to win a national election again as America gets more diverse and all these things. And it's looking like the opposite. Democrats are going to be in the position where they're not going to be able to win elections if they cannot reinvent themselves, realign themselves with the will of voters and the will of people. Because this election in Florida, this election nationally, was broadly a rejection in so many ways of parties, the political system, perspectives. People are just dissatisfied with so many different things and they want change.
And so, Molly, there's a few months before Trump takes office. What are you going to be paying attention to when it comes to abortion?
So I'm really interested in what the deeply red states like Texas or Louisiana, Oklahoma, what these states are going to do even before Trump takes office, not only on abortion, but on other issues. But I think abortion is an interesting one because even before Roe fell, they were doing a lot of the things. They were passing other kinds of restrictions on abortion clinics, like incremental restrictions, some that are known as trap laws. And I think we could see other states following that playbook, along with these deeply red states doing even more extreme things, even before Trump takes office, to try to force the administration's hand and say, look, you support states' rights. This is what the states want to do. Are you going to get on board with this or not?
Well, Molly, thank you so much for taking the time to explain all this. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Molly Hennessy-Fisk reports on red states for The Post. Here are a couple of other stories from The Post to pay attention to today. Trump and his team are already making decisions on who to serve in top positions in the new Trump administration. Trump has tapped Republican lawmakers, including South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem, to lead the Department of Homeland Security. Trump is also expected to nominate Florida Senator Marco Rubio as Secretary of State. And he's asked Florida Representative Mike Waltz to be the White House National Security Advisor. Both Rubio and Waltz are considered to have more hawkish foreign policy views than Trump. Trump is also expected to pick Stephen Miller to serve as his deputy chief of staff to help oversee an immigration crackdown. During Trump's first term, Miller helped develop policies such as the ban on travel from Muslim-majority countries and the separation of families at the U.S.-Mexico border. The Post is tracking all of Trump's picks as they happen. You can find that tracker on WashingtonPost.com. Just today, Trump announced he's nominating former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee as ambassador to Israel. Huckabee has taken a hard line against Hamas amid President Joe Biden's efforts to broker a ceasefire deal. Speaking of Israel, a new analysis from The Post found Israel has largely failed to comply with U.S. demands to increase aid to Gaza. Last month, the Biden administration gave Israel an ultimatum: increase access to aid in the next 30 days, or risk losing some military support from the U.S. The deadline is today. Israeli authorities have touted their progress, pointing to a successful polio vaccination campaign and the opening of another crossing into Gaza. An Israeli official told The Post that they have responded positively to most U.S. questions. But The Post spoke with more than a dozen humanitarian workers and officials who found that Israel has only allowed a fraction of the humanitarian trucks into Gaza that Washington requested. Insecurity around border crossings also remains a problem, making aid tough to access for people, and bringing parts of northern Gaza closer to famine. On Tuesday, the State Department said it would continue to monitor the steps Israel is taking, but that it hasn't yet assessed that Israel has violated U.S. law. That's it for Post Reports. Thanks for listening. We want to hear from you about what questions you have about the second Trump administration, whether it's about the impact of Trump's proposed tariffs or his plans for the federal government. You can send your questions to postreports@washpost.com. Today's show was produced by Peter Bresnan. It was mixed by Sam Baer and edited by Monica Campbell. Thanks to Susan Levine, Frances Stead Sellers, and Maggie Penman. Additional reporting for this episode was provided by Rishma Kirpalani. I'm Elahe Izadi. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from The Washington Post.